further ado, I'm gonna just tell y'all a little bit more about myself and my journey. So I am kind of an engineer turned MBA turned product guy. Like many of y'all, I went to UT and then I went to go work at Accenture here in Austin in their government practice. I started as a software engineer, but found myself a little bit more interested in why the government agencies were kind of using our software to better serve their citizens. So I transitioned into a business analyst role. And so that was more than 15 years ago. So I've been doing kind of some flavor of product in that context. I didn't think consulting was the right long-term career path for me. So I went to B school up at Michigan Ross, and I used that as a way to transition into the world of startups. So my first year, I worked for a student-run company called Hitchters. We got acquired a couple years after graduation. And then my second year, I started a company called TerraPerks with a classmate. Our mission was to encourage sustainable behavior on a daily basis. And our first product was a Facebook app that lets you compare your energy usage to your friends and family. So I spent about a year and a half trying to sell that to utility companies and home energy professionals. And then I got engaged and realized that a salary would be really nice. And so I joined a company out in the DC area that was doing something very similar called O-Power in the residential energy efficiency space. And I joined as a product manager, focused on some internal tools for our operations team. Found myself again a little bit more drawn onto the consumer side of things and understanding what might be happening. And so I joined a different startup out in the DC area called Hello Wallet. We made financial wellness web and mobile apps that help people reach their financial goals, and we sold that as an employee benefit. So I joined as a senior product manager, and about a year afterwards, we got acquired by one of our investors, Morningstar. So I ran the product team at Hello Wallet for about a year after the acquisition. And then Morningstar asked me to come out to Chicago and take over a couple of additional products, two robo-advisors, which were also sold as employee benefits. And so I managed a $40 million product portfolio with a team of about 20 people. So that was product managers, product operations, and technical project managers. However, when I got to Morningstar, I kind of missed the startup world. They're not a huge company, but it was definitely bigger than anywhere I had worked for quite some time. And so I started doing some advisory work on the side at 1871, just kind of working with startups and sharing some of my lessons learned on the product side. I really enjoyed it. And so when we moved back to Austin about 3 years ago to be closer to friends and family, I reached back out to Ben Foster, who ran product and design when I was at O-Power. And O-Power went public about 6 years ago, and Ben retired the day of the IPO and started doing some product advisory and coaching work. And I knew that he had been doing it for quite some time. And so I reached out, we reconnected, and it happened to be really great timing because he was actually thinking about joining one of his clients as a full-time chief product officer. And so he did that about 3 years ago, and I took over the advisory practice. And so during that time, I've worked with about 30 companies over the past 3 years. And our firm is called Prodify, as you might have seen on the title slide. But what Ben and I did over the past 6 years, we kind of have worked with probably around 70 companies, and then have been in product management roles ourselves for decades. We started identifying a lot of the patterns that we were seeing from talking with our clients and realizing that everyone was sort of facing some similar challenges. And so last year we got together kind of all of the best practices we had learned from doing our advisory work and being product managers ourselves. And we put it together into a framework that we called vision-led product management. And then this year we ended up putting out the book. In fact, it just came out about a month ago, called Build What Matters, that explains the vision-led product management framework. Like I said, I'll share this deck out here. So if it's ever interesting to look at the sort of like contents or anything like that. But one of the things we talk about in the book, the first chapter kind of opens up we call out what we call the 10 dysfunctions of product management, which are some of the most common like issues and challenges we've seen the product teams kind of facing. And in chapter 2, we kind of present a solution which starts with becoming more product driven as a way of addressing those 10 dysfunctions. And while we've worked with about 70 companies over the past 6 years, we've probably met closer to 250 or 300 companies. And sometimes it doesn't end up being the right fit or the right timing, but often what we hear is, especially startup founders and executives, and maybe even slightly larger organizations saying, well, we want to be more product driven. And when we ask them what that means to them, we get a lot of these kind of just blank stares. And so, what we wanted to do is kind of define this and clarify what we think, kind of what it means to be product driven. And then as we're going to get into, kind of talk about what it means or how you'll know from an organizational perspective, whether, you're kind of exhibiting some of those traits. But before I talk about what it means to be a product-driven company, I want to talk about sort of the opposite, which is sort of how a sales-driven company would think about delivering value to their customers. And if you were to imagine for a second that, like, I'm about to show this like kind of circle with a bunch of dots on it, and imagine that all the dots are sort of individual customers, and each customer has a different need and desires and evaluation criteria. So at a sales-driven company, they would think about each individual customer and go do the deep dive analysis on their requirements and stuff. But they would build a sort of custom solution for every single customer, as represented by these maroon boxes in the bottom left. And so, this is sort of how a lot of services companies would operate. Obviously, I worked at Accenture, so I know that this is how we build software for our government agencies. And so this obviously doesn't scale very well. And so we'll talk a little bit about why being product driven it helps in that dimension. And so I wanted to set this up to sort of explain what is the alternative almost to being a product driven company. And now I want to talk about how a product driven company would look at this same map of potential customers and like buyers or users in a slightly different way. So it's the same thing. The circle represents a universe of all potential buyers and customers you could have. The dots represent each individual customer. However, you'll note that there's a couple of shaded areas here, and the difference in how a product-driven company delivers value is by starting with a very clear target audience for whom they're trying to build that product. And so the green shaded area and the green dots represents a zone where the product does win in the market. It is the best solution out there. And those green to dark green dots are the customers who are all very excited and happy with the product because it does meet their needs and it was explicitly designed for them. This gray zone with the sort of like orange dots would represent the target market of how that product company might be thinking about expanding the reach of their product. And so those orange dots represent prospective customers, and they have different needs. They didn't fall into the same range as the green customers, and so that means that they probably had different requirements. They had different use cases. They might have had different price budgets. They might have had different evaluation criteria in how they decided whether a product was going to be a good fit for them or their organization. And so in the product driven company, they would focus on these target markets first and foremost and build a product that really met the needs, where these sort of needs were clustered together in these zones that are kind of color coded here. So what about all these red dots? What do they represent? Well, at the product driven company, these are all the people who would never be satisfied by the product because it was never designed for them. And I think one of the things that is important here is to call out that there are these people out there, and you need to know when you're talking to a prospect or a customer whether they fall into your target market or not. You see up here in the top left this question mark with this customer who feels like they're probably frustrated. They're like, what is this thing? Those are the customers who buy the product and it was never designed for them, but they're the most vocal and loud and they complain about it. And customer success or account management's always asking the product team, what can we do about this, folks? And I think it's very important to be conscious of where the feedback is coming from and whether that that customer or buyer was really part of who you were designing your product for. And so this is a little bit of an overview of how you could think about the product-driven company and how they would think about a market or a group of potential buyers. There's obviously the question of like, why does this even matter? Well, there's two reasons, and there are like two kind of categories of why this would matter. The first would be, why does it matter to your customers? Well, first and foremost, pricing is important, right? And with the product-driven company, pricing should be way lower than a custom solution, right? Think about the analogy of like going to IKEA and pulling something off the shelf versus like commissioning a custom woodworker to build you a new like bookshelf or something like that. It's going to be way more expensive for the custom build, right? Similarly, it would probably take that woodworker at least a few weeks, maybe a month or two, to actually get you that bookshelf. Where IKEA, like we could drive up to Round Rock right now and basically walk, be home with it today and have a bookshelf up on your wall. It also gives us in the software space the chance to really, your customers get a chance to get the latest and greatest, right? They're always building the latest, have the latest release, and we know that as we learn, the product gets better and they benefit from that, and because of the SaaS model. So why was being product driven matter to your company? Well, the first is it's more profitable, right? You don't have to pay to build a custom solution every time. You can take something off the shelf and offer it to the next customer at effectively a marginal cost of zero. And that matters a lot because then the valuation of your company goes up. Obviously, for those of you at startups, you know that this is an important thing to consider as you think about fundraising and making sure that the product and business is scalable, which is often what investors are looking at. Um, and finally, the last kind of benefit of being product driven is it gives you the optionality or the option to employ a product led growth strategy. You may have heard a lot about this sort of product led growth concept out there. Really, it boils down into sort of virality and how your existing users or customers can share and invite their friends or colleagues to use a product, and that's how other people discover it and might want to buy it. So obviously Zoom would be a classic example of product-led growth. You invite someone who doesn't yet use Zoom, they have to download the app and they see the value of having Zoom. I'd say another one that kind of specific for us in the product management space is for those of you who have used Miro. It's kind of like a collaborative whiteboarding product that you can pull people together and draw things on a canvas and share things like that. Again, it's another type of company that can deploy a product-led growth, but you have to be a product-driven company in order to do that. All right, so we've kind of talked a little bit about what it means to be a product-driven organization. I want to do a deep dive on the sort of like 5 traits, and so I'm going to cover each of them, and then we'll do like a deep dive on each one. The first is that product and UX are closest to the customer, and this is necessary in order to understand how these customers cluster together in that sort of circle diagram that we looked at earlier. The second is obviously that product-driven company would address the need of multiple customers with a single solution. This is sort of the shaded areas where you can create these markets where a single solution can serve the needs of a lot of different groups. The third is that the product-driven company would use technology to scale. Obviously, in the SaaS business, that's clear, but we'll talk a little bit more about even things like internal operational tools. The fourth trait of a product-driven company is that they would understand how the shifts in the market demand or future customers would impact their product direction. Obviously, in that diagram we looked at earlier, those dots were static. And so while you might be able to understand what the needs and evaluation criteria and requirements and use cases of your existing customers are today, it's important to understand if those dots are moving in different directions to understand where are these clusters of folks going to be in 1 or 2 years to make sure that the product, which often it takes time to build products, so by the time it hits the market you want to make sure it's still relevant, and that's why it's really important to make sure that you understand how the market is shifting. And then finally, the product-driven company succeeds by saying no. And this is almost necessary. If you said yes to every single customer request or feedback request and feature request and all those things, you would effectively become a sales-driven company, and the product would get so bloated that it would be hard to use for existing customers, and it would be maybe really complicated to get onboarded for new customers. So, like I said, I wanted to do a deep dive on each of these and provide some tactical kind of advice on what you might be able to do in this week or next week or the week after. So let's talk about each one of these. Oh, by the way, I will share there's some resources here if you want to measure how product driven your organization is and ask your teammates. There's a scorecard we created that kind of supplements the book. So this first trait is to be the closest to the customer. The biggest reason I feel like I hear from product teams is that they don't have time. But I think the question to ask is, can you delegate any decisions? And I think the example I'd use from my own experience is oftentimes during the sprint, there's a lot of questions that come up on an individual ticket or bug. They often are design or UX questions. And what I ended up doing was just asking my designer to take the lead on addressing some of those issues with the front end engineers or the engineering team more broadly. And they would just come back to me after 20 or 30 minutes and say, hey, here's what, we ran into this issue during the sprint. Here's what we think is the right answer. Or what do you think? And like 90% of the time I'd be like, yep, that's probably what I would have done anyways. Guess what? I just freed up like 30 minutes a day to go talk to customers and do user research and do those types of things. When we talk about research, I'd say there's 2 different types to consider. The more common is obviously usability testing. You show them like a new feature or some mock-ups and ask them what they think and whether they understand it. The strategic one is more around like, hey, tell me about your day. What are your goals at your, the B2B space? What are the goals for the company? How are you currently achieving those? What does the current solution space look like? What's working with the products you're using today? What's not working? So for competitive analysis. Those types of things. And so there's different types of research you're going to do to kind of understand your customers and be close to them. And one thing I would strongly recommend is using a tool like user interviews to recruit and schedule these interviews. I do hear a lot of like, well, where would I find these people? And user interviews has a great product. They have a panel of like 150,000 people across the US. It's both B2C and B2B. And I found the B2B side to be really good as well at finding buyers or like more professional users and things like that. Join a sales call. To me, there's nothing more powerful than hearing how sales positions the product, what features and value they talk about, what questions come up from prospects, what's going on in their head, what do they not understand, what are they asking whether the product does or not. It's really insightful to hear those types of things. And then finally, as the goal in all of these things, it's identifying like, what is that key outcome? What is this buyer or customer trying to accomplish? Why is it important to them? Why is it urgent? And you're really trying to prioritize that problem space when you get into that solution space. So that's kind of some thoughts on this first trait. And we do have a customer research guide if you want to learn more on sort of how to do this. There's a free guide that we have on our site. The first is, you have one solution for many customers. One thing to do as you think about this is to think about how many customers or users you need to build the business you want and how to hit your financial goals. I think the thing to consider is that if you're selling in the enterprise space, Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 even, you don't need millions of customers. You need 20 or 25 or something probably to really build a scalable business. And therefore, how sort of like scalable your product is depends on that. If you're working on Netflix, you obviously have to have an extremely scalable product that supports the needs of millions of users. So I think the first thing to do is to think about how many customers you need to support. I have an example here, which is if you think about how do taxes get filed. Well, the service-oriented business is like H&R Block, and on the other end of the spectrum is TurboTax, which when I looked at this, they had something like 50 million users, and obviously they had to scale using technology to provide a single solution. TurboTax then later kind of came down and sort of split the difference here, and they enabled this tech-enabled service where you actually talk to an individual CPA about your specific situation through video chats, and then it was kind of a new service offering, but just an example for how to think about how scalable does your product need to be. We use a framework called the Kano model to identify how to cluster the needs and desires and evaluation criteria of buyers and customers. There's a link here to a guide and a blog post I think that we have on our site. And I think the other thing to consider is to really make sure you've clearly identified those personas and whether they're buyers or users and that target market to make sure everyone internally is on the same page of who this product is for and why they were chosen as the target market. As you do that, you definitely want to talk to your sales, marketing, customer success teams to make sure executives that everyone's on the same page. This is a place where a lot of swirl will happen in the product space. Everyone kind of has different opinions on who the product should be for. And then try to use those artifacts to make a product decision this week, next week, whenever. Oh, sorry. Last week. All right, so trait 3 was using technology to scale. All right. I think the reason that this is really important for a few things to consider is that if having a vision of the product, of where the product is headed, can help inform architectural decisions. So engineering may choose different data model representations or architectural choices depending on having some sense of where the product in the market is headed. So this is kind of a place where the vision is important to have, even from a technical perspective. One thing, obviously you probably hear a lot of like, Wizard of Oz type feature releases where it's like, I do some things that were kind of unscalable. And I think that's okay. There might be a lot of people behind the scenes who are really trying to make a feature or experience come to life. And you do that to learn. And afterwards, then you can apply technology to sort of figure out how to scale it. And I think that the one thing to consider is really how some of these internal tooling and the operational costs of the business can be improved with technology. And kind of the example I have here is like, how would you scale a lawn mowing business, right? You might try to figure out how do you mow a lawn faster, and you kind of see how technology is helping improve it here. And then at the final end state, it's like you don't have to lift a finger; it's all automated. Just another example of how a product-driven company might use technology to scale. All right, so trait 4 was making sure that you have a deep understanding on sort of, understanding the market shifts and the future needs. One thing I think some questions to ask is what pressures are your buyers facing, regulatory, sort of market, commercial, what's shifting in the way that their customers are buying. And I think another thing to look at is like, what are some research reports that might help explain the upcoming shifts? So I think it's one thing to read them and understand sort of numbers around it. To me, the more important thing is to understand why buyers or users are changing their behavior and what's driving that. Another thing that might be good is to just identify a couple of industry newsletters that help you understand what's changing and keep stay up to date on the latest items. Or even better, talk to experts on who can tell you a little bit about where they think the market is going. And sometimes this could be your customers, and that they're a great source of market trends. Like, you may want to understand what their vision is and how your product fits into their picture, especially the enterprise or kind of more B2B sales. And we do have a market trends guide if you're trying to understand how to kind of capture all this information in a step-by-step process. This last trait, succeed by saying no. And I know that this one's a really hard one to do. So I had a couple of tips here. One is to create a yes/no flow chart. This was just an example I found on the internet. So like, hey, should I rent or buy? But what if you had this for like, should we accept this feature request, or like what types of feature requests or feedback or bugs or like operational issues do we actually accept and prioritize, and kind of helps you identify that. You may also consider doing a little bit of a retrospective on a product decision that you made recently and say, like, do we feel like we made the right choice? Why or why not? Should we have said no? Maybe we should have. How would we have known now that we know what we know now? And how can we use that going forward? And here's the hard one. Just try it. Try to say no this week or next week, or at least try to say something like not now, and rationalize to your stakeholders or your customers why now's not the right time and why you wouldn't prioritize that work. At the end of it all, I think, just ask yourself, are you building what matters? And that's kind of the core of being a product-driven company, is thinking hard about what matters to your customers. So with that, I saw some questions kind of coming into the Slack channel. Andrew, I don't know if you've just been doing kind of first come.
Please feel free to answer them in whatever order you'd like there. Yeah, there's certainly a couple coming in. So if you'd like to take either of those and just jump right into them.
Yeah, sure. Let me see. Then there's business driven, which considers the size of cluster, where competition is affordability, and later the ability.
I think the first one begins with Bill's question. Can no code package be used in traits 3 and 4?
Sure. Yeah, 100%, Bill. I think if you want to do something unscalable to start with, I think building alphas and betas using no code packages are great options as you think about how do you validate. All you're trying to do is validate that it is in fact a problem worth solving, and that the solution is better than whatever's out there. So I think those are great. And then I saw another question here around personas. What's your take on writing jobs to be done, assuming personas are usually flawed versus user stories? Yeah, great question, Robert. So here's my take. So the job story kind of takes the flavor of when this triggering moment happens, then I want to be able to do this thing, and here's why it matters to me. I think that makes sense. And I understand that the concept behind jobs is to sort of abstract the persona and the sort of like individual person to make sure that you're thinking more broadly. However, when push comes to shove, I think you can think of like different examples where understanding the context of like an environment under which someone is trying to accomplish that task, or like kind of extract that value from your product. Are they on their phone, or are they on a laptop, or are they like holding a baby in their hand? Or are they at work? Like all of those things I feel like matter a lot as you scope those stories and think about how to actually build something to meet the job story. And so what I have found personally, having tried the job story framework, is that that's what tripped us up. And so one thing we did do is we started connecting personas to job stories, just to make sure that there was a correlation of who are the different types of people who have that job to be done, who have a similar triggering moment where that job becomes top of mind and relevant. And so that was kind of a combination where we realized that personas and the context under which someone was using your product really did matter.
Okay, great. I see a few people typing. Okay, Bill's got another question there. There's a practice called continual experimentation, e.g. using Optimizely. What are your thoughts here what are your thoughts here, because the dev and DevOps gets involved, so there's a culture impact?
Yeah, so I think the thing that, well, this is like a whole deep dive, but in the way we talk about vision-led product management, there is a place and a time and a place for sure for what we call iteration on your product, right? Making modest tweaks to optimize conversion funnels or do A/B testing to understand what really makes sense. And I think that this is exactly the type of product or tool you would use like Optimizely to do so. However, what we talk about in the book is how we feel like there's been a little bit of a pendulum swing too far in sort of the agile mindset of like, oh, iterate, 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 which is, well, the reality is you'll never be able to iterate your way to innovative changes, right? And so we create 3 roadmap categories to consider as you think about what types of work most product teams will take on. Innovation is progress towards the vision, which is hopefully exciting and groundbreaking work. Iteration is modest tweaks to the existing product, maybe addressing customer feedback or usability issues. Then operation is the cost of operating a modern SaaS platform, performance, security, uptime, cloud migrations, all those types of things. And we ask teams to do a top-down allocation of what percentage of their capacity they feel like they should dedicate to each of those 3 different areas. Bill, what you're talking about in continuous experimentation definitely falls into the iteration bucket, and there's definitely a time and a place for doing that.
I'm not seeing any questions in the Slack channel at the moment, but I noticed you say a few minutes ago, you're talking about how you found some of the top dysfunctions of product teams and managers. Just so maybe as a final question here to take us out for the next 2 minutes or so, could you elaborate on the dysfunctions that you've found and observed?
Yeah, sure. We just did another podcast this morning. So, we actually started with a list of like 40 and we had to whittle it down to 10 just because we were like, of all the things we've experienced. Um, So I'll just call out kind of 3 that I think are really relevant. One is what we call the counting house, and this really comes down to an obsession over internal metrics like revenue and NPS and MAU, none of which matter to an individual customer. They could care less about any of those things, and we feel like if you buy into what gets measured gets managed. You create this focus on product teams just trying to figure out how to optimize metrics and that are kind of company focused. Well, they lose sight that those metrics are actually lagging indicators of whether you're delivering value to your customers. So instead, if you could define the metrics that your customers would use to measure the value of your product and figure out how to optimize those, as long as you've got a good, pricing package and pricing and packaging, all the business stuff will happen and really should follow suit. Another one is what we call the ivory tower, and it really comes down to just not doing any user research, never talking to your users, and these product managers kind of sit up in this like black box or in a cave almost and just like build product without really ever understanding the context or needs of their users. And so that's another one. And then a third one I'll call out is what we call the negotiating table, where the product manager is basically playing roadmap Tetris, trying to keep a lot of different stakeholders happy and trying to balance the needs of their internal stakeholders, but at the cost of what's right for the customer. So yeah, those are a handful of the ones that I think would be kind of top of mind. I will post a link to the top 10 dysfunctions. We just posted them on LinkedIn this week as kind of a snippet from the book.
Okay, terrific. I know I'd be interested. I'm sure others would be too. I see a question also about the book. So would you just mention the title again and tell people where they can find it?
Yeah, sure. So the book is called Build What Matters, and I will post a link. You can go to buildwhatmattersbook.com. I'll post a link in the Slack channel just so that folks have it as well.